Hello, Virgo. Um, you didn't stumble here. Not really. There are things we find by looking, and then there are things that find us in the middle of a quiet moment when we finally stopped being loud enough to drown them out. This is one of those things. And somewhere in you, you already know why. Um, Someone has been talking about you, not to you, about you, in a room you weren't in a conversation that happened without your knowledge, without your permission, in the particular kind of space that only opens up when you're not there to fill it. And something in you, that quiet, precise animal part of you, has been sensing it for a while now. Without knowing exactly what it was sensing, you felt it in the way certain people look at you slightly differently than they used to. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and say, there, that's it. Just a fraction of a second longer than normal, or a fraction shorter. A warmth that's been adjusted, a comfort that's been recalibrated, something in the texture of how you're being received that doesn't quite match what was there before. And you noticed, of course, you notice everything. That's both your gift and your particular kind of weight. You pick up on things other people miss entirely. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than the shift in someone's tone mid-sentence. The pause that comes a half second too late. The smile that reaches the mouth but stops just before the eyes. You've always read people like that. Quietly, without announcing it, filing things away in some part of yourself that never quite forgets. And lately, something has been filed, something has been accumulating, a collection of small, almost imperceptible moments that individually mean nothing, but together they make a shape. And the shape has been forming slowly enough that you've been able to tell yourself it isn't there, that you're reading too much into things, that you're projecting, that your imagination is constructing a pattern out of coincidence and insecurity. But it isn't insecurity. Is it because insecurity is loud? Insecurity repeats itself. Insecurity needs reassurance constantly, urgently, in ways that exhaust even yourself. But this is different. This is quieter than insecurity, more patient, more specific. It doesn't spiral, it just sits and points at something real. There's a specific feeling that comes when you realize you've been the subject of a conversation you weren't invited to. It's hard to describe precisely. It's not quite anger, not quite hurt. It's something more unsettling than both of those. Something that sits in the space between violation and curiosity. Because part of you wants to know urgently, immediately, what was said, by whom, in what tone, with what intentions behind it. And another part of you, the part that's been around long enough to know certain things, isn't sure it wants to know it all. Because knowing changes things. That's the thing nobody really prepares you for. Not just the knowing itself, but the way it retroactively reshapes everything that came before it, the way it reaches back into your history with someone and recolors it, makes you look at moments you remember warmly and wonder, was that real? Was that genuine? Or was there something underneath it that I couldn't see because I wasn't supposed to? And that wondering, that retroactive recoloring, is its own particular kind of grief. Not the sharp kind, not the loud kind, the slow kind, the kind that seeps, the kind that makes you sit quietly in the middle of something ordinary and feel a sadness you can't immediately explain. Because you're not just processing what happened, you're processing the gap between what you thought was happening and what was actually happening. And those two things sometimes are very far apart. Now, here's where it gets more complicated. Because the conversation that happened, the one about you, without you, you don't actually know what was said. Not entirely. Maybe you have fragments. Maybe you have a sense of it. Maybe you have nothing at all except the feeling that something was said. And what's interesting, what's worth sitting with, is what your mind has been doing with that not knowing. Because it hasn't left it empty. Has it? Your mind has been filling in the gaps quietly, automatically. The way minds do when they sense something without having the full picture. And the stories it's been constructing, the versions of that conversation it's been rehearsing, they say something. Not necessarily about what was actually said, but about what you fear, about what you believe, somewhere underneath everything, about how you're seen, about what you suspect people think of you when you're not in the room to shape the narrative. And that right there might be the more important conversation. Not the one that happened between them, but the one that's been happening inside you, the one you've been having with yourself about your own worth, your own image, your own place in the minds of people you care about. That conversation has been running quietly in the background for much longer than this situation. This situation just brought it forward, made it harder to ignore, gave it a specific shape it didn't have before. Because here's something that's worth saying carefully. The intensity of what you feel right now, the particular sharpness of it, isn't just about them. It isn't just about the conversation. It's about what that conversation is touching in you. What old wound it found. What ancient fear it activated. What part of you, the part that learned a long time ago that being talked about without your knowledge means something dangerous, got triggered by this. because you've been here before. Maybe not in this exact situation, but in this exact feeling, this specific combination of exposure and helplessness, the sense of being seen or misrepresented or reduced in a space where you had no voice, where you couldn't correct it, couldn't contextualize it, couldn't be there to be fully, complexly yourself instead of whatever version of you was being discussed. And that the inability to be fully yourself in someone else's telling of you, that's one of the oldest, deepest discomforts there is. Because, you know, that you are more than what anyone says about you in a room. You are more than the version of you that exists in someone else's story. More than the you that gets discussed, analyzed, reduced into something manageable enough to talk about over a phone call or a coffee. You are in ways that are genuinely difficult to communicate. More than that. And yet there's something about knowing you were the subject. Something about the specific vulnerability of it that makes you feel, just for a moment, like that reduced version might be the real one. Like the version they discussed might be closer to the truth of you than the version you present. Like their private assessment of you, whatever it was, might somehow be more accurate than your own. That's the part worth pausing on right there. Why would someone else's private, incomplete, secondhand version of you feel more true than your own direct experience of yourself? Why does being talked about, especially when you don't know what was said, have the power to make you doubt what you know about yourself? What is that? Where does that come from? It comes maybe from a long history of learning that other people's perceptions of you had consequences, real consequences, that how you were seen determined how you were treated, that the stories people told about you, even the private ones, even the ones you never heard, shaped the world you moved through. And so you learn to care deeply, sometimes too deeply, about how you're perceived, about what people think when you're not there, about the version of you that lives in other people's minds when you have no control over it. And that caring, exhausting as it is, isn't vanity. It's not weakness. It's a very human response to a very real thing. We are social creatures. We exist in relation to each other. How we're seen matters. It has always mattered. The need to be accurately perceived, to be seen clearly, honestly, in your full complexity, that's not a flaw. That's one of the most legitimate needs a person can have. But here's the shift. Here's the thing that might change the texture of all of this slightly. What if the conversation wasn't what you think it was? Not in a dismissive way, not as a way of telling you that you're wrong to feel what you feel, but genuinely, what if the version of that conversation your mind has been constructing is darker than what actually happened? What if the words that were said, the actual words in their actual tone, came not from resentment or betrayal, but from something more complicated, something more human, like confusion or concern, or even, and this is the one that's hardest to sit with, admiration that didn't know how to express itself directly. Because people talk about the ones who affect, that's worth remembering. People don't have private conversations about people who are irrelevant to them. They don't analyze, discuss, return to people who don't matter. The fact that you were the subject, regardless of what was said, is less than #0. 5 hash is greater than means you occupy space in someone's mind, real space, significant space, the kind that generates conversation even in your absence. And that's when you let yourself feel it clearly. That's not nothing. That's actually something. Now, here's maybe the most honest thing that can be said about all of this. You will probably never know exactly what was said. Not entirely. Not with the clarity your mind is craving. And the craving itself, that urgent need for the full picture, is worth looking at. Because what is it you're actually hoping to find? If you could hear that conversation, proof that you were wrong about them, proof that you were right, confirmation that you're valued, or confirmation of the fear, the one that sits just underneath everything, that you're not. And if it's the last one, if part of you is almost searching for the evidence that confirms the fear, that's worth sitting with very carefully, because that's the pattern, that's the loop, the one that takes a situation, any situation, really, almost any situation, and finds in it the proof of what you already believe about yourself, the belief that runs deepest, the one you inherited or learned or built slowly out of the accumulation of moments. When you felt reduced, when you felt misunderstood, when you felt like the version of you that existed in someone else's telling is less than #0, 5 hashes greater than was somehow the definitive one. That belief, whatever specific form it takes in you, is the thing underneath this situation. This situation didn't create it. It just found it. The way a bruise gets found, not because someone meant to press exactly there, but because the bruise was already there, already tender, already waiting for something to make contact with it. And what would it mean? Just as a question, not as an instruction. To stop organizing your sense of worth around what gets said about you in rooms you're not in. What would it actually feel like to let other people's private assessments of you be theirs? Incomplete, limited, built from whatever fragment of you they've had access to, and to hold quietly, privately, without needing anyone to confirm it, a different version, the fuller one, the one only you have full access to, uh, because the truth of you, the actual complex, contradictory, unfinished truth of you, doesn't live in that conversation. It never did. It can't. No conversation about you, however long, however well-intentioned, however intimate, can contain the full truth of what you are. That's not a failure of the people talking. That's just the nature of being a person. You are too much for any single telling. And somewhere underneath the hurt, underneath the need to know, you already know that. Some part of you, the steadiest part, the part that doesn't get rattled by things like this, already knows that what was said about you is not the final word on who you are. Can't be, will never be, no matter who said it, no matter what they said, no matter how close they are to you. The final word on who you are, if there even is such a thing, is still being written by you in the quiet decisions, in the private moments, in the way you treat yourself when nobody's watching and nothing is being discussed. And the only conversation happening is the one between you and the truest version of yourself. That conversation, the one nobody else has access to, that's the one that matters. Not because the others don't, but because it's the only one